A poor woman was evicted and humiliated without mercy, in front of everyone with nowhere to go. The broker treated her like human trash, ignoring the frightened daughter clinging to her lap. When all seemed lost, a wealthy man witnessed the scene and decided to act in silence. Before we continue, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which city you are watching us from. There are moments in life when everything seems to fall apart all at once, as if the ground simply vanished from beneath our feet. Sarah knew that feeling well. She was 32 years old, with dark hair that no longer shone as it once did, hands calloused from so much work, and a gaze that carried the weight of someone who had been fighting alone for far too long. She lived in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town in rural Pennsylvania, where the dirt roads merged with cracked asphalt and humble houses were scattered without much planning. Sarah's life had never been easy, but she always found a way to keep going. She worked as a janitor at a local public school, waking up before sunrise, taking 2 buses to get to work, and returning home only as night was falling. The wages were low, but they were enough to pay the rent for the old travel trailer where she lived with her daughter, buy the basics at the grocery store, and with much effort, still have a few cents left over for an emergency. She didn't ask for luxury. She didn't dream of trips or expensive clothes. Sarah only wanted dignity, a secure roof, and the certainty that she could raise her girl far from the hardships she herself had faced in childhood. But life has a way of doing these things. These moments where everything changes in a matter of days, even hours. Everything began to crumble when Aunt Martha, the only family member who still kept in touch with Sarah, passed away suddenly. Martha was a widow who lived alone in a simple little house on the other side of town, and from time to time helped Sarah with some groceries, a coat for the girl, or simply words of encouragement when everything felt too heavy. It wasn't a large amount of financial help, but it was enough to make a difference. More than that, Martha was the only person Sarah could call when she needed someone, when exhaustion hit hard, and she felt she couldn't handle everything on her own. When Martha was gone, Sarah felt as though she had lost more than an aunt. She lost her only support network, the only hand extended in a world that seemed increasingly cold and distant. The funeral was simple, few people attended, and Sarah had to borrow money from a neighbor to pay for the burial expenses. It was at that moment that she realized how truly alone she was. She had no one else, no cousins, no close friends, no shoulder to lean on. It was just her and the responsibility she carried on her shoulders. The weeks that followed were even more difficult. Sarah tried to maintain her routine, waking up early, going to work, coming back, taking care of the home, preparing food with the little she had in the pantry. But something inside her was changing. The fatigue was no longer just physical. It was a deep exhaustion that took over every thought, every movement. She felt her body heavy, her mind confused, and as much as she tried to hide it, she knew she was at her limit. It was on a Monday morning that everything took a turn for the worse. Sarah arrived at the school as usual, greeted her colleagues, put on her uniform, and began cleaning the hallways. She was mopping the floor in the teacher's lounge when the principal called her into her office. Sarah's heart tightened. She knew that kind of summons never came with good news, and she was right. The principal, a middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a dry way of speaking, got straight to the point. The county was cutting costs, outsourcing services, and the school needed to reduce its staff. Sarah was being let go. Just like that. No prior notice, no chance to defend herself, no explanation that made real sense. She even tried to argue, reminding the principal that she was always on time, that she never missed work without a reason, that she did her job with dedication. But the principal only shook her head and said the decision had already been made. She could pack her things and leave that very day. Sarah left that office with shaky legs. She grabbed her old bag, changed clothes in the bathroom, and walked through the school gates for the last time. The street was empty. The strong sun hit her face, and for a moment, Sarah stood there, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do. She had just lost her only means of support. How was she going to pay next month's rent? How was she going to buy food? How was she going to explain to her little girl that things were about to get even harder? She returned home dazed, entered the trailer, and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The space was small and cramped, with old and improvised furniture, but it was all she had. She looked around and saw the nearly empty refrigerator, the sink full of dishes that still needed washing, the thin walls that let in the cold of the night and the heat of the day. That place had never been a real home, but it was her refuge, the only corner in the world where she could close the door and breathe. In the following days, Sarah tried to look for another job. She knocked on door after door, left resumes at grocery stores, bakeries, shops, and hair salons. She offered to clean houses, wash clothes, tend gardens, anything that would pay some money. But the answers were always the same. They weren't hiring, they already had someone. They would keep her contact info if something came up. She returned home every day with empty hands and an increasingly heavy heart. The rent came due and Sarah had no way to pay. She tried to talk to the owner of the lot where the trailer was parked, a man named Richard, who managed several properties in the area. Richard was a middle-aged fellow with a protruding belly, a shirt always unbuttoned at the top, and an arrogant way of speaking. He didn't even want to hear Sarah's explanation. He said he wasn't interested in excuses. He wanted the money, or she would have to vacate the space. Simple as that. Sarah begged for more time, promised she would pay as soon as she found work, but Richard only laughed with disdain and said he had heard that story many times before. He gave her a 1-week deadline to leave voluntarily, or he would take measures himself. The conversation ended with a gate slammed in her face and the sound of Richard's cruel laughter echoing in her ears. That week was the most agonizing Sarah had ever lived through. She continued looking for a job with desperation, even asking neighbors for help. But everyone looked away, saying they were also having difficulties, that they couldn't help. The loneliness weighed more than ever. Sarah felt like she was screaming for help in a place where no one wanted to listen. At night, lying next to her daughter, she looked at the ceiling of the trailer and felt tears streaming down in silence. She couldn't break down in front of the girl. She needed to be strong, even when she felt no strength inside her. She began eating less so there would be more food for the child. She skipped meals, saying she wasn't hungry, but the truth was that her stomach ached from emptiness and her head felt too light. The water and electricity were cut off. The trailer sat in darkness at night, and Sarah had to use old candles to light the space. Water had to be fetched from a community tap a few blocks away, and she carried heavy buckets back home, her arms aching and her breath short. The situation reached its most critical point when the refrigerator was completely empty. There was nothing left. Not a piece of stale bread, not a leftover bit of rice, not a piece of fruit. Sarah opened the door of the broken appliance and stared at that void as if it were a reflection of her own life. She sat on the cold floor and put her hands over her face. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry out loud. She wanted someone to appear and say that everything was going to be okay. But there was no one. Only the heavy silence of that cramped space and the certainty that the worst was yet to come. On the 7th day, Richard appeared. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 large men with crossed arms and hard expressions and began shouting outside the trailer, demanding that Sarah leave immediately. She opened the door trembling, trying to ask for just a little more time, but Richard wouldn't listen. He ordered the men to start removing her belongings from the trailer and tossing them onto the street. Sarah tried to stop them. She screamed, she cried, but she was pushed aside without any consideration. The few clothes she had, the old blankets, the broken kitchen utensils, everything was thrown onto the dirt ground in front of the trailer. Neighbors came out to watch, some with pity, others with morbid curiosity, but no one moved to help. Sarah felt the humiliation burning in every part of her body. She was being exposed, stripped of any dignity before eyes that judged without knowing anything. When it was all over, Richard locked the trailer with a new padlock and said that if Sarah wanted to get anything back, she would have to pay everything she owed with interest. Then he turned his back and walked away without looking back, leaving Sarah standing there in the middle of the street, surrounded by her scattered belongings and with nowhere to go. She gathered what she could into 2 torn bags. She took her daughter by the hand and began to walk. She didn't know where she was going. She had no plan, no hope. She only knew she needed to get out of there, that she couldn't stay in that place where she had just lost the last shred of dignity she had left. The sky was grey, threatening rain, and Sarah followed the dirt road with her head down and a broken heart, carrying the weight of a life that seemed to have no way out. Sarah didn't know how long she had been walking. It could have been minutes or hours. She could no longer tell. The dirt road stretched ahead with no apparent end, flanked by old fences and empty lots. The weight of the torn bags cut into her fingers, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't look back. If she did, she would see that locked trailer, that street full of people who only watched her humiliation without moving a muscle to help. The girl walked beside her in silence. That silence hurt more than any scream. Sarah knew the child felt everything, perceived the fear, the uncertainty, the despair that hung in the air like a heavy cloud. From time to time, the little one looked up as if she wanted to ask a question, but something in the tense expression of her mother's face made her remain quiet. Sarah was grateful for that, and at the same time felt an enormous guilt. What kind of mother was she, who couldn't provide even the minimum security for her own daughter? The sky remained heavy, and the wind began to blow harder, kicking up dust from the road and making the trees sway. Sarah felt a shiver run through her body. She didn't have a proper coat. The thin blouse she wore offered no protection against the cold that was beginning to set in with the approach of night. She needed to find somewhere before it got completely dark. But where? She didn't know anyone in that region. She had no money to pay for a room, not even to buy a simple meal. She thought about going back, about trying to talk to a neighbor again, begging for a night of shelter. But her wounded pride and the recent humiliation weighed too much. She didn't want to see those looks of pity. She didn't want to hear empty excuses or have doors closed in her face. So she kept walking, putting one foot in front of the other, even without knowing where she was headed. That was when the first drops of rain began to fall. Light at first, but they quickly turned into a persistent drizzle that soaked everything. Sarah looked around desperately. She needed shelter, anything that would protect them from the rain that threatened to turn into a storm. She spotted a large tree a few yards ahead and ran toward it, pulling the girl by the hand. They leaned against the wide trunk, but the canopy wasn't enough to keep the water out. In a few minutes they were drenched. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, trying to warm her with her own body. She felt the child shivering, the small cold fingers clutching her wet blouse. She closed her eyes and prayed. She prayed for the rain to stop, for someone to pass by and have mercy, for a miracle to happen. But the rain only increased, and the road remained empty and silent. That was when she heard the sound of an engine. She opened her eyes and saw an old pickup truck approaching slowly down the road. Her heart raced. Could it be someone who could help, or just another person who would drive straight past, pretending not to see her despair? Sarah stepped out from behind the tree and stood in the middle of the road, raising her hand in a gesture of plea. The truck slowed down and stopped a few yards ahead. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, likely in his 40s, with brown hair slightly graying at the temples, wearing simple but clean clothes. He had a serious face, marked by wrinkles that told stories Sarah didn't know. He looked at her, at the girl shivering with cold, at the soaked bags lying on the ground. He didn't say anything for a moment, just observed with those dark eyes that seemed to calculate the situation. Sarah didn't know what to say. The words tangled in her throat, mixed with tears she tried to hold back. Finally, it was the man who broke the silence. "Are you all right?" His voice was deep and controlled, but not cold. There was something in it that wasn't exactly kindness, but it wasn't indifference either. Sarah shook her head. No, she wasn't all right. Nothing was all right. But how could she explain all that to a stranger? How could she tell him she had been kicked out of her home, that she had no money, that she had nowhere to go, that she was there in the middle of a deserted road, without any hope? "I need help," she managed to say finally, her voice choked. "I have nowhere to go. I have nothing." The man continued looking at her, and Sarah saw something change in his expression. It wasn't pity. It wasn't compassion in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, as if he recognized in her a pain he himself had once felt. He looked away at the empty road, at the dark sky, and then turned back to face her. "Get in the truck," he said finally. "I'll take you somewhere you can get out of the rain." Sarah hesitated. All the warnings she had heard in her life about not accepting help from strangers echoed in her mind. But she looked at the girl, saw her lips blue from the cold, her small body shaking uncontrollably, and she knew she had no choice. She needed to protect her daughter, even if it meant trusting someone she didn't know. She picked up the soaked bags and followed the man to the truck. He opened the back door and helped settle the things on the seat. Sarah got in with the child, closed the door, and felt the immediate relief of being protected from the rain. The man turned on the heater, and warm air began to circulate through the interior of the vehicle. They drove in silence down the road. Sarah looked through the foggy window, trying to identify the path, but everything looked the same. empty fields, a few scattered houses, wire fences. After about 20 minutes, the truck left the main road and entered a rural property. There was a worn wooden gate, a fence that stretched to the sides, and in the background a simple house of exposed brick. The man parked near the house and got out. Sarah did the same, still suspicious, still alert. He took her bags and walked toward a barn that stood next to the main house. Sarah followed him, keeping her daughter close. "You can stay here for now," the man said, opening the barn door. "It's not much, but it's dry and protected. I'll bring some blankets and something for you to eat." Sarah entered the barn and looked around. It was a wide space, smelling of hay and old wood. There were some tools leaning against the walls, bales of straw stacked in a corner, and a relatively clean area in the center. It wasn't comfortable, but it was infinitely better than staying under the rain on the road. "Thank you," Sarah managed to say, her voice faint. "I don't know how to thank you. I won't be much of a bother, I promise. As soon as the rain passes, we'll leave." The man looked at her with that same serious expression. "You don't need to leave tomorrow. Stay as long as necessary to get yourselves organized. I just don't want any trouble, all right? I don't accept chaos or disrespect." Sarah nodded quickly. "You can trust me. I won't cause any trouble. I just need some time to think, to find a way out of this situation." He didn't say anything else, just left the barn and returned a few minutes later with a thick blanket, a bottle of water and a bag of bread. He placed everything on the floor near Sarah and left again. She stood there, holding the bread with hands still trembling, feeling tears finally flow without control. That night, Sarah and the girl slept curled up in the blanket, on a pile of hay they improvised as a bed. The wind rattled the wooden walls of the barn, and the rain continued to fall outside, drumming on the roof in a constant rhythm. Sarah couldn't sleep much. She stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the child's breathing beside her, and thinking about how she had ended up there. Who was that man? Why had he decided to help them? Was it safe to trust him? Sarah had no answers, but she knew that, for now, that barn was the only thing standing between her and complete hopelessness. She decided that in the morning she would talk to him, try to understand his intentions, and perhaps, if it were safe, stay there for a few days until she could gather the strength to start over. Dawn arrived grey and cold. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy. Sarah woke up with an aching body and a heavy head. She got up slowly, tucked the blanket around her daughter, who was still sleeping, and stepped out of the barn. The property was larger than she had realized the night before. There was a pasture with a few cows, a chicken coop, a small vegetable garden. Everything was simple but well kept. She saw the man coming out of the house with a mug of coffee in his hand. He noticed her and made a gesture for her to approach. Sarah walked toward him, still insecure, still trying to understand what to expect. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, without much emotion in his voice. Sarah shrugged. "It was better than being on the street. Thank you again for taking us in." He took a sip of coffee and looked toward the horizon. "My name is Caleb. I've lived here alone for a few years. I don't usually have visitors or get involved in anyone's life, but I couldn't just leave you out there in the rain." Sarah nodded. "I'm Sarah, and I'm truly grateful. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't appeared." Caleb looked at her sideways. "You don't have to tell me your story if you don't want to. But if you're going to stay here for a few days, it would be good to have some clear rules. You can use the barn, you can get water from the tap near the house, and if you want to help with something around here, I'd appreciate it. But respect is fundamental. I don't touch your things, you don't touch mine." Sarah agreed immediately. "Consider it done. I'll help with whatever is needed. I know how to clean, cook, take care of animals. I don't want to stay here as a charity case. I want to at least give back in some way." Caleb finished the rest of his coffee and turned to enter the house. "Then it's settled. If you need anything, just say so." Sarah stood there watching him disappear into the house. She felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief for having found a temporary shelter, a breath in the middle of the storm. Apprehension for not knowing who that man really was or what his true intentions were. But she didn't have much choice. She needed that place. She needed time to think, to plan her next steps. And as much as she was suspicious, there was something about Caleb that didn't seem threatening. Something in his loneliness, in his restrained way of speaking, that seemed to hide a story as painful as her own. She went back to the barn and decided that while she was there, she would do everything in her power not to be a burden. She would work. She would help. She would show she was worthy of that chance. And deep down, a small spark of hope began to glow. Maybe, just maybe, this was the opportunity she needed to start again. The first days in the barn were a time of silent adaptation. Sarah woke up early, even before the sun rose, and began moving. She cleaned the space where she slept, organized the few clothes she had managed to save, and then went to the tap to get water to wash herself. The morning cold bit at her skin, but she didn't complain. She was used to hardships, and this was still better than many situations she had faced before. Caleb maintained a respectful distance. He wasn't cold, but he wasn't warm either. He greeted Sarah when he saw her, sometimes asked if she needed anything, but for the rest of the time he followed his solitary routine. He cared for the animals, worked in the garden, fixed fences and gates. He worked in silence, with precise and economical movements, like someone who had learned to do everything alone and expected help from no one. Sarah observed everything closely. She wanted to understand how the property functioned, where she could be useful, how she could repay Caleb's generosity without being invasive. On the third day, she offered to clean the house. Caleb hesitated, looked at her with that serious expression that was becoming familiar, and then agreed with a nod. The house was simple. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with old, functional furniture. Everything was organized, but there was a layer of dust that gave away the lack of attention to detail. Sarah began to clean methodically, wiping the furniture, sweeping the floor, washing the dishes piled in the sink. While she worked, she noticed some details that told stories. There were framed photographs on the living room wall. One of them showed a younger Caleb, smiling beside a beautiful blonde woman and a small boy. The happiness captured in those faces contrasted with the heavy loneliness that now inhabited that house. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. Something terrible had happened there. Something that had transformed that smiling man in the photo into the reserved and distant being who now lived alone. She didn't want to ask. She knew that other people's pain deserves respect, that everyone deals with their losses the way they can. She continued cleaning, keeping that silent information within herself. In the afternoon, when she finished the work in the house, Sarah went to the garden. Caleb was there, hoeing between the rows of vegetables. She approached slowly and offered help. He looked at her hands, calloused from so much work, and handed her a smaller hoe. "Pull the weeds between the lettuces," he said, pointing to a specific area. "Be careful not to pull up the good plants." Sarah began to work, concentrated. The sun was strong, and she soon felt sweat running down her back, but she didn't stop. She liked working with the earth. She felt it connected her to something larger, to a rhythm that didn't depend on money or social status. The earth was honest. If you cared for it well, it bore fruit. If you neglected it, it didn't produce. Simple as that. They worked side by side for over an hour in silence. It was Caleb who broke the silence first. "You know how to work the land," he said, not as a question but as a statement. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I grew up in the country. My grandmother had a small plot where she planted everything. I spent a lot of time helping her before I had to move to the city." Caleb nodded. Cities swallow people. They promise things they never deliver. Sarah looked at him, surprised by that comment which seemed to come from personal experience. "Did you live in the city before?" "I did," Caleb replied, his voice growing deeper. "I had a life there. Work, family, plans. But life has a way of turning everything upside down when you least expect it." He didn't say anything else, and Sarah didn't push. They went back to work. But now there was something different in the air, a tacit understanding, a recognition that both carried deep wounds. They didn't need to talk about them to know they were there. In the following days, Sarah began to take on more tasks. She cared for the chickens, gathered the eggs, helped milk the cows. She discovered she had a way with animals, that they responded to her patience and gentleness. Caleb noticed this and began to trust her with more tasks. They weren't orders, they were invitations. A look, a gesture, and Sarah understood what needed to be done. The girl was also changing. In the first few days she had been scared and withdrawn, but gradually she began to explore the property. She liked being near the animals, watched the chickens with curiosity, and tried to approach the cows carefully. Caleb didn't interact much with the child, but Sarah noticed he left small things in the barn: a box of cookies, a warmer blanket, an old toy that must have belonged to his son. Sarah felt her heart tighten when she saw these small kindnesses. Caleb wasn't a man of words or grand gestures, but he showed care in subtle ways, and that meant more than any beautiful speech. One night, after an especially tiring day, Sarah was sitting at the barn door looking at the starry sky. Caleb came out of the house and walked over to her, bringing 2 mugs of hot coffee. He offered one to Sarah and sat on an old log beside her. "Are you looking for a job in town?" he asked, breaking the silence. Sarah took a sip of coffee. "I'm trying, but it's not easy. No one wants to hire someone without references, without a fixed address. And I have none of that." Caleb was silent for a moment, looking at the stars. "There's plenty of work here. The property is small, but it's enough for 2 people to look after. If you want, you can stay. I can't pay a salary, but I guarantee a roof, food, and some income when we sell the produce from the garden and the eggs." Sarah looked at him, surprised. "Are you serious?" "I am." Caleb faced her. "I'm not making this offer out of pity. I'm making it because you work well and don't give me a headache. But I need it to be clear. I expect nothing but honest work. No drama, no trouble." Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. It was the first time in a long time that someone recognized her value, that someone saw beyond the desperate woman asking for help. Caleb was offering something more than temporary shelter. He was offering a new beginning. "I accept," she said, her voice choked, "and I thank you so much. You can trust that I will give my best." Caleb nodded and went back to looking at the sky. Then it settled. They sat there in silence, drinking coffee and listening to the sounds of the night. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and hope she hadn't experienced in a long time. There were still uncertainties, still fears, but for the first time in weeks, she felt she might be able to build something new there. In the days that followed, the routine gained a more stable rhythm. Sarah woke up early, prepared breakfast for herself and Caleb, cared for the animals, worked in the garden and cleaned the house. In the afternoon, she went to town to try to sell the eggs and some vegetables at a local farmer's market. Caleb had an old spot there, and Sarah took on this task with dedication. It was during one of these trips to town that Sarah saw Richard for the first time since the eviction. He was on the corner of a busy street, talking to 2 men in suits. Sarah felt her stomach churn. She wanted to change her path, avoid any contact, but it was too late. Richard saw her and a cruel smile formed on his lips. "Look who's here," he said loudly, drawing the attention of passers-by. "The deadbeat who vanished without paying what she owes." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The people around began to stare. She lowered her head and tried to keep walking, but Richard took a few steps toward her. "You think you can just disappear? You still owe 3 months' rent, and I'm going to get every last cent." Sarah stopped and turned to face him. "You kicked me out and threw my things in the street. I have nothing to give you." Richard laughed with disdain. "That's not my problem. I'm going to take this to court. I'll make you pay, even if you end up in jail for debt." Sarah felt her legs weaken. She knew he was bluffing in part, that debtors' prisons didn't exist like that, but she also knew Richard had contacts, resources, and could make her life even harder. She turned her back and left as fast as she could, feeling his cruel gaze burning into her back. When she got back to the property, she was shaking. Caleb noticed immediately that something was wrong. He asked what had happened, and Sarah told him about the encounter with Richard and the threats. Caleb listened to everything in silence, his expression becoming increasingly serious. "Is this man dangerous?" he finally asked. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know, but he's angry at me, and angry people are capable of anything." Caleb was thoughtful. "We'll resolve this. I won't let him threaten you." Sarah looked at him, surprised. "You don't need to get involved in this. It's not your problem." Caleb stared at her with that intensity she was starting to recognize. "If you're living here, working with me, then your problems concern me too. I'm not going to stand by while someone unfairly hunts you down." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude and emotion. She wasn't alone. After so much time fighting without support, there was someone willing to stand by her side. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because he saw value in her, because he believed she was worth fighting for. That night, Sarah lay in the barn with a restless mind. She knew Richard wouldn't give up easily, that the threats were real. But she also knew that now she had something she didn't have before: hope, and someone who believed in her. And that, somehow, made all the difference. The following weeks brought a deceptive peace. Sarah dedicated herself to the work on the property with vigor, and gradually she established a routine that seemed almost normal. She woke up with the rooster's crow, cared for the animals, worked in the garden alongside Caleb, and at night fell into bed exhausted, but with the satisfaction of someone who had fulfilled their duties. The girl was more cheerful, played in the yard, helped gather the chickens' eggs, and even began attending a small nearby school that Caleb had managed to enroll her in. Sarah felt she was finally rebuilding something. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of. It wasn't perfect, but it was dignified. And dignity was all she needed at that moment. Caleb remained reserved, but slowly he was opening up. They talked during breakfast, exchanged opinions about the work, and from time to time he told small stories about the property, about how he had bought that place years ago with the intention of creating a refuge far from the chaos of the city. It was during one of these conversations that Caleb finally mentioned his family. He said he had lost his wife and son in a tragedy 7 years ago. He didn't go into details, and Sarah didn't ask. The pain in his gaze was enough to understand that the wound was still open, bleeding silently. Since then, Caleb had isolated himself, avoiding contact with people, building walls around his heart. Sarah understood perfectly. She also had her walls, her defenses, but slowly there on that property, she felt it might be possible to lower her guard a little, to trust again, to believe that not everyone was going to disappoint or abandon her. The illusion of peace was brutally interrupted on a Thursday morning. Sarah was in town selling eggs at the market when she saw 2 police officers approaching. Her heart raced immediately. She knew something was wrong. The officers stopped in front of her and asked for her ID. Sarah handed it over with trembling hands. "Are you Sarah Miller?" asked one of the officers, looking at the document. "I am," Sarah replied, her voice coming out faint. "You need to come with us to the station. There is an accusation against you." Sarah felt the world spin. "Accusation? What accusation?" "Theft and abandonment of property with material damages," the officer explained. "Mr. Richard Sterling filed a formal complaint. You need to provide a statement." Sarah tried to argue, to say it was all a lie, that Richard was inventing charges to persecute her, but the officers were firm. They said she could come voluntarily or she would be taken by force. With no choice, Sarah gathered her things and followed them to the cruiser. The ride to the station was silent torture. People at the market looked on with curiosity and judgment. Sarah felt the humiliation burning in every part of her body. Once again she was being exposed, judged, treated like a criminal without having done anything wrong. At the station, she was interrogated by a middle-aged detective who seemed to have no interest in hearing her version. Richard had presented a list of items he claimed had disappeared from the trailer: appliances, furniture, tools. All lies. Sarah hadn't taken anything besides her clothes and a few personal items, but Richard had photos, documents, and even a witness who confirmed his story. Sarah tried to defend herself, explaining she had been brutally evicted, that her belongings had been thrown in the street, that she hadn't taken anything that wasn't hers, but the detective only shook his head and said he needed concrete proof. Witnesses, receipts, anything that demonstrated her innocence. She was released that day, but with the obligation to appear again the following week. She left the station with shaky legs and a broken heart. How could Richard do that? How could he invent such serious accusations just for revenge? She returned to the property late at night. Caleb was waiting on the porch, worried. When he saw Sarah arrive with her face marked by tears, he stood up immediately. What happened? Sarah told him everything: the accusations, the interrogation, the threat of a criminal process. Caleb listened in silence, but Sarah could see the anger growing in those dark eyes. "This man needs to be stopped," Caleb said firmly. "I won't let him destroy you with lies." Sarah shook her head, desperate. "He has money, he has contacts, he has power, and I have nothing. How am I going to prove my innocence?" Caleb approached her and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Look at me. You are not alone in this fight. I'm going to use every resource I have to help you. I know a lawyer in the city, someone honest who can guide us. We'll gather evidence. We'll show that Richard is lying." Sarah felt tears stream down. "You would do that for me? Why?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Caleb replied without hesitation, "and because you deserve justice." In the following days, Caleb kept his promise. He sought out the lawyer, a man named Arthur, who had an office in the city and knew well the maneuvers of people like Richard. Arthur listened to Sarah's story and said she had a great chance of overturning those accusations, but he needed time and evidence. Sarah began to gather everything she could: memories, names of neighbors who had witnessed the eviction, any evidence that proved she hadn't taken anything but what was hers. Caleb helped, hiring a private investigator to check Richard's history, and what they discovered was shocking. Richard had a pattern. He had already made similar accusations against other people who couldn't pay rent. He used his power and influence to persecute the most vulnerable, extort money, and clean his own reputation while destroying others. There were old lawsuits, archived complaints, testimonies from people who had been his victims. With this information, Arthur built a solid defense, but before they could present everything officially, something worse happened. Sarah received a court summons. Richard had managed to get a temporary custody order, claiming she represented a flight risk. If she didn't appear in court in 3 days, an arrest warrant would be issued. Sarah panicked. The situation was spiraling completely out of control. Caleb tried to calm her, saying the lawyer would contest that order, but Sarah knew the system didn't always work in favor of the weak, and if she were arrested, what would happen to the girl? That night, Sarah seriously thought about running away, taking her daughter, gathering the few things she had and disappearing, going to another city, starting all over again somewhere where Richard couldn't find her. But as she packed her things in the barn, she looked around and saw everything she had achieved there. The safe place, the dignified work, the reborn hope. Would it be fair to throw it all away and go back to the road? Would it be fair to run from a false accusation and live the rest of her life looking over her shoulder? No. Sarah stopped in the middle of the barn and made the hardest decision of her life. She wasn't going to run. She was going to face Richard. She was going to fight for the truth. She was going to show she was no longer the desperate woman who could be trampled without consequences. She had dignity, she had support, she had proof, and she was going to use it all to defend herself. When Caleb arrived at the barn and saw Sarah standing there with a determined expression on her face, he knew immediately what she had decided. "Are you going to stay and fight?" he asked. "I am," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm tired of running, tired of being a victim. I'm going to face this with my head held high." Caleb smiled. It was the first time Sarah saw him truly smile, and that smile carried pride and respect. "Then let's do this together," he said, "and we will win." Over the next 2 days, Sarah, Caleb, and Arthur worked tirelessly. They gathered documents, recorded statements from neighbors, and obtained copies of previous complaints against Richard. They put together a complete dossier that showed not only Sarah's innocence, but also Richard's pattern of abuse and harassment. On the day of the hearing, Sarah entered the courthouse with shaky legs, but her head held high. Caleb was by her side, and that gave her strength. Richard was there too, accompanied by an expensive private lawyer and an arrogant expression. He looked at Sarah with contempt, as if he had already won. But the hearing did not go as Richard expected. Arthur presented all the evidence, showed Richard's history, and called witnesses who confirmed Sarah's version. One of the neighbors who had witnessed the eviction had the courage to speak, telling how Richard had thrown Sarah's belongings into the street without mercy, and how there had been no theft at all. Richard tried to counter, but his lies began to crumble before the evidence. The judge, a serious man with graying hair, listened to everything carefully and then asked some direct questions that left Richard without convincing answers. When Caleb was called to testify, his words were firm and respectful. He told how he had found Sarah and her daughter on the road, how she had worked honestly on his property, and how she demonstrated integrity every day. He said he knew enough people to distinguish an honest person from a dishonest one, and that Sarah was one of the most dignified people he had ever met. Caleb's testimony carried weight. He had a reputation in the county as a serious, reclusive man who didn't get into trouble. If he was there defending Sarah, it was because he truly believed in her. At the end of the hearing, the judge asked for a recess to analyze the evidence. Sarah waited outside the courtroom with her heart racing. Caleb stayed by her side in silence, but his presence was comforting. When they were called back in, the judge gave his decision. The accusations against Sarah were groundless and based on fragile and contradictory evidence. The case would be dismissed for lack of consistent proof. Furthermore, he ordered that Richard be investigated for possible false accusations and abuse of power. Sarah felt her legs weaken with relief. She had won. The truth had prevailed. Caleb took her by the arm and guided her out of the courthouse. When they were on the street, Sarah finally broke down. She cried tears of relief, of exhaustion, of gratitude. Caleb let her cry, standing there beside her without saying anything, just offering presence and support. "You were incredible in there," he finally said. "You showed that you're no longer the woman I found on the road. Now you know how to fight for yourself." Sarah wiped her tears and looked at him. "I wouldn't have made it without you. You gave me more than shelter. You gave me the strength to believe I deserve justice." Caleb shook his head. "The strength was always in you. I just gave you the opportunity to see it." They returned to the property with an enormous weight lifted from their shoulders. The fight hadn't completely ended, but the most important battle had been won. Sarah had proven her innocence and stopped Richard from destroying her. And now, for the first time in a long while, she could look to the future without fear. The months following the victory in court brought a profound transformation in Sarah's life. The property that was once just a temporary shelter began to become something much larger, a true home. And not just for her, but for Caleb too, who gradually put aside his isolation and allowed life to flow back into that space that for so long had been marked only by silence and pain. Sarah woke up every day with a renewed purpose. She was no longer the desperate woman who accepted any crumb of kindness. Now she knew her value, knew her strength, and was determined to build something solid and lasting. She continued working on the property with dedication, but she began to think beyond the daily tasks. She wanted to truly contribute. She wanted her work to generate income and autonomy. It was Caleb who suggested she expand the production of the vegetable garden. He said there was plenty of space, good land that wasn't being used. Sarah accepted the idea with enthusiasm and began to plan. She researched more profitable crops, talked to other producers at the market, and decided to invest in organic vegetables and medicinal herbs that had good demand in the region. Caleb helped prepare the land, and together they worked side by side for weeks. They hoed, fertilized, and made organized garden beds. Sarah felt an immense satisfaction watching that project take shape. It wasn't just manual labor, it was the construction of a future, and for the first time in a long time, that future seemed possible. The production began to yield results. The vegetables grew lush and healthy, and when Sarah took the first batches to the market, they had a better reception than she expected. People liked the quality, the freshness, and she soon gained loyal customers who came back every week to buy. The income wasn't large, but it was honest and growing. Sarah began to save part of the money, planning for the future, thinking of possibilities. In addition to the garden, she started making homemade products. Jams, breads, cookies. She used the fruit from the property and recipes she had learned from her grandmother. Caleb tasted the first batches and was impressed by the quality. He suggested she sell them at the market too, and Sarah agreed. The products were an immediate success. People praised the flavor, the authenticity, and soon Sarah needed to increase production to meet the demand. The kitchen of the house, which had previously been little used, was now full of activity. Sarah spent her afternoons there, preparing recipes, experimenting with combinations, perfecting techniques. Caleb sometimes stayed nearby, observing, making comments, and gradually, that kitchen stopped being just a functional space to become a place of sharing and togetherness. The conversations between Sarah and Caleb also changed. They were no longer just brief exchanges about work. Now they talked about plans, dreams, and memories. Caleb began to tell more about his past, about the life he had before the tragedy, about the dreams he had been forced to abandon. Sarah listened with attention and respect, without judgment, without pity, just presence. And Sarah also opened up. She talked about her difficult childhood, about the choices she had to make, about her mistakes and successes. She talked about the fear of not being good enough, about the guilt she carried for not being able to give her daughter everything she wanted. Caleb listened with the same respectful attention and then said something that stayed in her mind. "You already give her the most important thing. You teach her that dignity isn't lost when life gets hard. That honesty is worth more than money. That starting over is always possible." Those words touched Sarah's heart deeply. Caleb saw something in her that she herself sometimes had trouble seeing. He saw strength, courage, integrity, and that gaze, that genuine recognition, made Sarah feel valued in a way she had never experienced before. The girl also flourished in that environment. She was happier, more relaxed, more confident. She made friends at school, brought drawings and projects home to show, and told animated stories about her day. Sarah saw the transformation in her daughter and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. That was the greatest sign that she had made the right decision by staying and fighting. Caleb, who at first had kept his distance from the child, began to interact more, not in an effusive or forced way, but with small gestures that showed genuine affection. He fixed a broken toy, taught the girl how to care for the chickens, took her to see the newborn calves. The child responded with enthusiasm, and gradually a special connection began to form between them. Sarah noticed all of this and felt contradictory emotions. On one hand, she was happy seeing that closeness. On the other, she feared she was creating expectations that could be frustrated. Caleb had never promised anything beyond shelter and work. There was no formal commitment, no guarantees, and Sarah didn't want to pressure him. She didn't want to turn gratitude into emotional dependency, but it was impossible to deny that something was changing between them. Their gazes lingered a bit longer. The silences became comfortable instead of awkward. Their hands brushed during work, and neither pulled away immediately. There was a growing attraction, a mutual respect that went beyond simple coexistence, a complicity born of shared experiences. It was on a full moon night that everything became clearer. Sarah was sitting on the porch after an especially tiring day. Caleb came out and sat beside her without saying anything. They stayed there watching the starry sky, listening to the crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Have you thought about staying here permanently?" Caleb finally asked, breaking the silence. Sarah looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean not as a temporary worker, but as a partner. In the property, in the projects, in everything." Sarah felt her heart race. "What exactly are you proposing?" Caleb turned to face her. "I'm proposing that we share everything. The responsibilities, the profits, the decisions. That we build something together larger than what we have now. No hierarchy, no forced obligations. As equals." Sarah was silent, processing those words. It was more than she had expected, more than she had dared to dream. But it was also scary. It meant commitment, trust, vulnerability. "And what if it doesn't work?" she asked, her voice faint. "What if I disappoint you?" Caleb shook his head. "You've already proven you're trustworthy. You've shown you work hard, that you're honest, that you fight for what's right. I'm not making this proposal out of pity or on impulse. I'm making it because I believe that together we can make this work." Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. "I accept. I want to build this with you." Caleb smiled, and it was a genuine smile, full of hope and relief. Then it settled. In the following days, they formalized the partnership. They went to a notary, registered everything officially. Sarah now had legal rights to part of the property and the profits. It wasn't charity, it wasn't a favor. It was recognition of her work, of the value she added, and that made all the difference. With the security of the partnership, Sarah felt even more motivated. She began thinking about expanding the business. She wanted to set up a small processing facility for the products, get organic certifications, maybe even export. Caleb supported all the ideas, and together they began working on these long-term projects. Sarah also began to get involved with the local community. She discovered there were other women in difficult situations, single mothers struggling to survive, people who had gone through hardships similar to hers. She felt called to help, sharing her knowledge about farming, small business management, and how to get back up after hard falls. Caleb watched all of this with admiration. Sarah hadn't forgotten where she came from. She hadn't let success go to her head. She remained humble, generous, and willing to help, and that made him respect her even more. One afternoon, while they were working together in the garden, Caleb stopped and looked at Sarah with a serious expression. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice hesitant. Sarah stopped working and faced him. "Go ahead." "When you arrived here that rainy night, I was in a very dark place. I had given up on truly living. I just existed, spending my days doing mechanical tasks, without purpose, without joy. You and the girl brought life back to this property. You reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for." Sarah felt emotion tighten her throat. "You saved me first, Caleb. You gave me shelter when I had nothing. You gave me the chance to start over." Caleb shook his head. "We saved each other. And that is the most beautiful thing of all. They stood there, looking at each other, and Sarah felt there was something more unsaid hanging in the air. Something about feelings that went beyond professional partnership, beyond friendship. But neither had the courage to verbalize it at that moment. Perhaps it was still too early. Perhaps they needed more time to understand what they truly felt. But one thing was certain. The connection between them was real and deep. They had found each other in the most difficult moments of their lives and had chosen to build something together. And that choice, day after day, was proving to be one of the best both had ever made. Sarah went back to the barn that night with a light heart. She looked around the space that had been her first shelter and realized she no longer slept there. Caleb had offered one of the bedrooms in the house, saying it made more sense now that they were official partners. Sarah had accepted, and gradually she transformed that room into a cozy space. The barn now served as a storage area for the products she manufactured. It was full of jam jars, bags of flour, and organized boxes. It was a visual symbol of the transformation that had occurred. The place that had been a shelter of despair was now a space of production and prosperity. Sarah lay down in the comfortable bed, covered herself with a warm blanket, and looked out the window at the starry sky. She thought about everything that had happened in the last few months. The humiliation of the eviction, the desperate walk, the meeting with Caleb, the fight in court, the reconstruction. Each stage had been painful, but necessary. And now she was there in a safe place, with a renewed purpose, with real hope. It wasn't the end of the story, she knew that. There were still challenges ahead, still uncertainties. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt she was in control of her own life. She was no longer a victim of circumstances. She was the protagonist, the builder of her own destiny. And that, more than any material achievement, was the true new beginning she had always sought. A year after that rainy night when Sarah had been found on the road, the property was completely transformed. What was once a place marked by silence and loneliness was now a vibrant space full of life and movement. The vegetable garden had expanded considerably, occupying nearly half of the available land. Organized rows of organic vegetables grew healthy, and there was even a small greenhouse where Sarah grew aromatic herbs and medicinal plants. The production of homemade foods had grown so much that it was necessary to set up a specific space for a production kitchen. Caleb and Sarah worked together to renovate part of the barn, installing basic but functional equipment. Now Sarah produced not only jams and cookies, but also artisanal breads, preserves, and sauces. Everything was made with ingredients from the property itself, or purchased from small local producers. The products had gained a loyal clientele. Sarah sold at the market every week, but she also began supplying some local shops and cafes in town. Her income had increased significantly, and for the first time in her life, Sarah had financial security. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. She could pay the bills, buy decent clothes, and even save money for emergencies. And that, for someone who had faced hunger and humiliation not long ago, was a massive achievement. Caleb had also changed. The closed and solitary man Sarah had first met gave way to someone more open and present. He smiled frequently again, made plans for the future, and believed that life still had good things to offer. The property stopped being just a refuge to become a life project, and he shared that project with Sarah as a true partner. The relationship between them had evolved naturally. There were no dramatic declarations or grand gestures. Simply, bit by bit, they realized that what they felt for each other went beyond professional partnership or friendship. There was genuine affection, deep respect, and an attraction that grew every day. And when they finally allowed themselves to express those feelings, it was something peaceful and natural, like everything between them. Caleb asked Sarah to be his girlfriend on a simple afternoon while they were working side by side in the garden. There was no elaborate speech. He simply looked at her and said he wanted to make official what they had both been feeling for a long time. Sarah accepted with a wide smile and bright eyes. And that night, they had dinner together as they always did, but now with the certainty that they were building not just a business partnership, but a shared life. The girl watched everything with evident joy. She had become genuinely fond of Caleb, seeing in him a protective and caring figure. Caleb responded with tenderness, caring for the child with attention without trying to force a role that wasn't his. He respected that Sarah was the mother, but he was present as someone who truly cared. Sarah began to get more and more involved in social projects. She discovered that there were several women in the region in situations similar to what she had lived through. Single mothers, women who had lost everything, people trying to start over after harsh crises. Sarah felt called to help, to share the knowledge she had acquired. She began by offering free workshops on organic farming and homemade food production. She taught simple techniques that anyone could apply in small spaces, showing how it was possible to generate income with few resources. The women who participated in the workshops were impressed by Sarah's generosity and patience. She didn't just teach techniques, she shared hope. Caleb supported all these initiatives. He even went so far as to set aside part of the property so Sarah could create community gardens, where the women in the project could practice what they learned. The property stopped being just their home to become a space for collective transformation. One day, Sarah received an unexpected visit. It was one of the neighbors who had witnessed her eviction on that humiliating morning more than a year ago. The woman arrived ashamed, apologizing for not having helped, for having stood there just watching. Sarah received her with kindness and without judgment. "I understand," Sarah said. "Sometimes we are paralyzed by fear or the feeling of helplessness. But what matters is what we do afterward, when we have the chance to choose differently." The neighbor shared that she was going through similar difficulties. Her husband had abandoned the family. She was unemployed and she was afraid of not being able to pay the rent. Sarah listened to everything with attention and offered practical help. She pointed out job openings, taught some homemade production techniques, and most importantly, offered emotional support. That encounter confirmed for Sarah that her purpose went beyond her own survival. She had gone through humiliation, pain, and despair, and now she could use those experiences to help other people not to give up, to believe that starting over was possible. Sarah also went back to school. She enrolled in a small business management technical course offered for free by the county. She wanted to learn more about administration, marketing, and finance. She wanted to further professionalize the business she had built with Caleb. She attended classes at night after a full day of work, but she didn't feel tired. She felt enthusiasm. Caleb was proud watching her dedication. He said Sarah had an incredible ability to transform difficulties into learning, to draw strength from where there seemed to be none. And Sarah always replied that he had been fundamental in that process, that without the shelter and initial support, none of it would have been possible. But Caleb insisted the merit was hers. Many people receive help and do nothing with it. You took an opportunity and built an empire from it. That is all you. The plans for the future were ambitious but realistic. Sarah and Caleb wanted to expand production, get certifications that would allow them to sell to larger markets, and maybe even export. They also wanted to formalize the social work, creating a cooperative that could employ other women in the region and offer true professional training. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be obstacles and challenges, but they weren't afraid. They had learned that resilience isn't about never falling. It's about knowing how to get back up every time life knocks you down. And they had gotten up together. One night, Sarah was on the porch looking at the starry sky. Caleb approached and sat beside her. They stayed in silence for a few minutes, just appreciating the tranquility of that moment. "Have you ever stopped to think about how much has changed?" Caleb finally asked. Sarah smiled. "I think about it every day. Sometimes it still seems unreal, like I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream." "It's not a dream. It's real. You built this with your own hands." Sarah looked at her own hands, still calloused from work. "We built it," she corrected. "You gave me the chance. You believed in me when no one else did." Caleb shook his head. "I only offered a shelter. You transformed it into a home." They sat there, in a comfortable silence, thinking about everything they had overcome. The humiliation of the eviction, the fear of homelessness, the unfair accusations, the fight in court. Each obstacle had seemed impossible to overcome at the time, but looking back, Sarah saw that each one had been necessary. It had molded her character, strengthened her determination, and shown what she was capable of. And now she was there, in a safe place, beside someone who loved and respected her, building a life that had meaning. It wasn't the perfect life. It wasn't the dream life she might have imagined when she was younger. But it was a dignified, honest life, full of purpose, and that was worth more than any fantasy. The girl appeared at the door, already in her pajamas, and ran to hug Sarah. The child had grown. She was stronger and more self-assured. She no longer carried the fear and uncertainty of those terrible days on the road. Now she had a real home, a stable routine, and adults who cared for her with affection. Looking at her daughter, Sarah felt she had fulfilled the promise she had made to herself on that rainy night. She had promised she would turn things around, that she wouldn't let humiliation define her, and that she would raise the girl in a dignified environment. And she had succeeded. Not alone, but she had succeeded. Caleb stood up and extended his hand to Sarah. "Let's get some sleep. We have a lot of work ahead tomorrow." Sarah took his hand and stood up. "There's always a lot of work ahead, but now I'm not afraid of it." They entered the house together, closed the door, and the property fell silent under the starry sky. A silence different from what Caleb had known before. It was no longer the silence of loneliness and grief. It was the silence of peace, of satisfaction, of those who know they have built something solid and true. And there, in that piece of land that had been the stage for so much pain and so much renewal, two lives that seemed destined for despair found each other and discovered that it is always possible to rebuild. That dignity is not lost when we accept help. It is lost when we give up fighting. That true love isn't what is born in grand romantic gestures, but what grows in the day-to-day in shared work and in mutual respect. Sarah had learned that being strong doesn't mean never falling. It means having the courage to get up, to ask for help when necessary, and to fight for your rights when they are violated. She had learned that vulnerability is not weakness, it is humanity, and that accepting someone's extended hand doesn't diminish your value. On the contrary, it shows wisdom. Caleb had learned that the pain of loss doesn't have to define the rest of one's life, that it is possible to honor the past without being trapped in it. That opening the heart again doesn't mean betraying those who are gone. It means choosing to keep truly living. And together, Sarah and Caleb proved that unlikely encounters can generate the most profound transformations, that broken people can heal each other, that dignity is rebuilt one day at a time, one choice at a time, and that the true new beginning happens when we stop running and choose to face life with our heads held high, with courage and hope. Sarah's story wasn't about a woman who was saved by a rich man. It was about a woman who saved herself by choosing to fight for justice, by accepting help without losing her essence, and by transforming humiliation into strength. It was about a man who rediscovered himself by opening his life to someone in need. It was about two people who found each other at the right moment and chose to build something larger than themselves. And that story, like all stories of true new beginnings, did not have a definitive end. It only had a new beginning, full of possibilities, challenges, and hope. A beginning that Sarah and Caleb would face together, day after day, with work, love, and dignity. If you believe that destiny can be rewritten, that love can bloom where it's least expected, and that even the greatest challenges can be overcome by those who cross paths from opposite worlds, then my stories have something to say to you. Come, dive into these tales of lives that meet and transform. The best is yet to come. And who knows, maybe you'll find yourself in one of them. I've been narrating stories for a few years now, and it is a pleasure to share each chapter, each emotion with you. If you enjoyed this,